When The Exorcist hit theaters in 1973, people weren't ready. Audience members fainted. Some screamed and ran into the streets. Paramedics were called to theaters across America. Critics called it the most terrifying movie ever made. But what most didn't know was this. The story wasn't just Hollywood fiction. It was based on a real case. In 1949, a 13-year-old boy convulsed violently, spoke in guttural voices, scratched words into his own skin, and terrified every priest who tried to help him. The Catholic Church gave him a pseudonym, Roland Doe. To this day, his true identity has never been confirmed, but the priests who were there kept diaries, and what they wrote down is far more disturbing than anything you saw on screen. Roland Doe was born in 1935, just outside Washington, D.C. His father worked for the government. His mother was deeply religious, and they raised him under strict Lutheran discipline. Roland was an only child, lonely, withdrawn. He didn't have many friends. Teachers described him as quiet and polite, but detached. He spent much of his time with adults instead of children his own age. His closest bond was with his Aunt Harriet. Unlike his parents, she was warm, playful, and curious about the spiritual. She indulged Roland's imagination. She told him stories about the paranormal, and one day she introduced him to something that would change his life forever: the Ouija board. To Harriet, it was harmless. To Roland, it was fascinating. The two of them spent hours experimenting with it. Roland believed it worked. He believed he could reach something on the other side. Then, in early 1949, Harriet died suddenly. Roland was devastated, and in his grief, he turned back to the Ouija board, only this time, he used it alone. Soon after, the disturbances began. It started small. Scratching sounds in the walls, at first dismissed as rats, but the noises grew louder, sharper, more deliberate, like fingernails dragging across plaster. Then objects moved on their own. A vase toppled over. Books fell from shelves. Heavy furniture slid across the floor. At night, Roland's bed shook violently. His parents would rush in to find their son clutching the mattress, begging them to make it stop. Teachers noticed Roland's handwriting changed overnight once neat. It became jagged and wild, like it belonged to someone else. Neighbors whispered that something was wrong in the house. His few friends stopped coming around, and then came the scratches. Thin red welts across his body, at first random, but one night they spelled something unmistakable. L-O-U-I-S. Roland's mother froze. To her, it wasn't random. It was a message. The family had relatives in St. Louis, Missouri, and she believed the scratches were instructions. Was it a demon mocking them, or a divine sign pointing them toward help? Either way, the message was received. Within days, the family packed their bags and headed west. Before the church intervened, Roland's family tried science. Doctors examined him. Nothing. Psychiatrists evaluated him. Some suggested hysteria or schizophrenia. But Roland's outbursts only worsened. He would slip into violent trances, thrashing with unnatural strength. Witnesses said it sometimes took 3 or 4 adults to hold him down. Scratches appeared spontaneously across his skin. Objects still moved on their own. And sometimes, his voice dropped into a guttural tone, speaking in languages he'd never learned. Doctors had no answers. That's when his mother insisted this was not medical, this was spiritual. The family turned to the Catholic Church. That's when Father William Bowden, a Jesuit priest from St. Louis, stepped in. Bowden wasn't alone. He assembled a team of priests and began the ancient rite of exorcism. And they kept detailed diaries of what they saw. Those diaries describe nights of pure terror. Roland convulsed whenever holy water touched him. Crucifixes rattled and fell from the walls. His body contorted unnaturally, at times levitating above the bed. Strange guttural voices spoke through him, mocking the priests, calling them by name. Words appeared scratched into his skin. Spite, hell. One diary entry reads, "The boy cried out in a deep voice not his own. He mocked us as weak servants. His body shook so violently that 3 men struggled to restrain him." Another wrote, "Tonight, the word hell appeared across his chest in red marks." His lips curled into a sneer. He spat and cursed with a voice unrecognizable as his own. During one session, Roland ripped a spring from his mattress and slashed a priest's arm. Another time, he lunged with such force that multiple priests were thrown off balance. This wasn't one night, it wasn't a week. These exorcisms stretched on for nearly 2 months. By March of 1949, the priests were exhausted. Some doubted they could continue, but they pressed on. The climax came during one final session. Roland thrashed violently, his eyes rolling back into his head. His body arched unnaturally, his mouth foaming. Then, according to the diaries, a guttural voice erupted from him, shouting, "Satan, Satan, I am Saint Michael, and I command you to leave this boy now." The room went silent. Roland collapsed onto the bed. Then, in a small, weak voice, Roland whispered, "He's gone." And just like that, it ended. After that night, Roland returned to normal. No more violent fits, no more voices, no more scratches. His family didn't stay in St. Louis. They left quickly, returning east and resettling in Maryland near Washington, D.C. Roland grew up, finished school, and eventually lived a quiet, suburban life. He married, had children, worked a steady career, and retired in peace. To his neighbors and co-workers, he was just another man. But behind that ordinary exterior was a boy who had once been the center of one of the most terrifying possession cases in modern history. Journalists who tracked him down decades later reported that he refused interviews. He never wanted to be associated with the story again. For the priests, the case haunted them until their deaths. For Roland, it was something he never spoke of again, but the story didn't die in St. Louis. The priest's diaries survived. And years later, a Georgetown student named William Peter Blatty discovered them. Fascinated, he transformed the case into a novel. He changed the boy into a young girl. He moved the setting to Georgetown. But the foundation, the shaking bed, the guttural voices, the scratches all came from Roland. In 1971, his novel, The Exorcist, was published. 2 years later, it became a film. The reaction was explosive. Audiences fainted in theaters. In Washington, ambulances were stationed outside cinemas. In Boston, theaters handed out bath bags. In some countries, the movie was banned. And yet, the hysteria only drew more people. Lines stretched around blocks. People waited hours just to see what was being called the most terrifying movie ever made. The film went on to earn 10 Academy Award nominations and gross more than $400 million worldwide. But the reason The Exorcist hit so hard wasn't just the spinning heads or the pea soup vomit. It was because audiences knew, at least in some way, that this story was rooted in reality. Skeptics have spent decades trying to explain the Roland Doe case. Some say he suffered from mental illness. Others argue it was a mix of poltergeist activity and teenage hysteria. But for the priests who were in that room, there was no doubt. They went to their graves insisting they had faced something demonic. One priest told a journalist before his death, "If you had seen what I saw, you would believe too. The Exorcist remains one of the most iconic horror films ever made. But behind the fiction lies the real story of a lonely boy who lost his aunt, turned to a Ouija board for comfort, and found himself at the center of a battle between faith and something unexplainable. The Exorcist terrified millions because it asked a question no one wants to answer. What if evil isn't just in our imagination? What if it's real and it can reach into your home, your family, your child? Hollywood exaggerated the details, but the foundation, the shaking bed, the guttural voices, the scratches all came straight from the real diaries of priests who swore until their dying day that what they witnessed factually happened. And that's the horrifying true story behind The Exorcist, a case shrouded in mystery, secrecy, and decades of debate. Was Roland truly possessed, or was it grief, trauma, and suggestion that spiraled into legend? What we do know is that his story became the foundation for one of the most terrifying films ever made. And even today, it blurs the line between myth and reality. If you enjoyed this video, wait until you hear about the real deaths that inspired Freddy Krueger. Click the video on screen now to uncover the true nightmare behind A Nightmare on Elm Street. And if you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because every week we dive into the real stories that inspire the world's darkest legends. Thanks for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one.